I've been a professional wedding planner for nearly a decade. I've dealt with all types of brides, some sweet, some entitled, some downright nightmarish, but nothing could have prepared me for what I went through with my own sister, Chloe. Chloe's always been the golden child. Growing up, she was the one who got everything she wanted. If she threw a tantrum, she got what she wanted. If she made a mistake, our parents made excuses for her. Meanwhile, I was the one who had to suck it up, be the responsible one, the one who didn't cause problems. Over time, I distanced myself, focusing on my own life, and tried not to let Chloe's behavior get to me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. She wasn't growing up, and I was starting to see the fallout. So when Chloe announced her engagement to Ryan, I knew this was going to be a problem. It wasn't just the wedding, it was everything that would come with it. Chloe had always wanted everything her way, and she wasn't exactly known for her budgeting skills. She and Ryan didn't have much money saved up, but Chloe was determined to have the most extravagant wedding possible. The problem was, she didn't understand the first thing about planning a wedding, let alone planning a wedding on a budget. And of course, she fully expected me to plan it for free. The first sign of what I was getting into came during a family dinner shortly after she and Ryan got engaged. Our parents were thrilled, and everyone was toasting to their future. Chloe was glowing, as if she had it all figured out. That's when she turned to me with the biggest smile on her face. "I don't even have to stress about planning," she said casually. "Emily's got it covered." I thought she was joking. She wasn't. She launched straight into her ideas for the wedding: floral arches, chandeliers, an A-list venue, custom bridesmaid dresses, live music. Every word she said screamed expensive. She didn't mention a budget. I waited for it, but it never came. "What's your budget looking like?" I asked, trying to gauge how much of a financial nightmare I was about to walk into. Chloe waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, we'll figure that out later. I mean, I'm not worried. You'll handle everything, right?" I froze. This was not a joke. She thought I would plan her entire wedding for free. I tried to stay calm, even though my blood was starting to boil. "Chloe, wedding planning is my job," I said slowly, trying to keep it professional. "It's how I pay my bills. I'd be happy to help in small ways, like recommending vendors or giving advice. But I can't plan the whole thing for free." Chloe's face immediately changed. Her voice went cold and sharp. "Wow, so strangers get your time, but your own sister doesn't?" I thought family was supposed to support each other. Before I could respond, my mom chimed in from across the table. "Oh, come on, Emily. It's her wedding. You're really going to make her pay? Just do it as a gift." I looked at Ryan, hoping for some backup, but he just sat there, awkward and silent. I stayed firm. "I can't do an entire wedding for free. I can offer a discount, but that's it." Chloe's mood shifted instantly. Her voice became high-pitched, almost whiny. "After everything I've done for you? I helped you move. I watched your dog that one time." I blinked. "You mean the time you let him pee on my couch because you didn't take him outside?" She was furious. "You're so selfish. I've been there for you, and you can't even do this for me? You're ruining my wedding dreams." By the end of the dinner, I was the villain. Chloe posted vague messages on social media about family betrayal and how some people only care about money. The extended family started texting and calling me, telling me I was ruining Chloe's once-in-a-lifetime moment. My mom begged me to apologize. "Just tell her you'll do it, Emily," she said, as if this whole thing wasn't a massive violation of boundaries. "She's under so much stress." I refused. Chloe didn't need my help, and I wasn't going to sacrifice my career just because she felt entitled to my services. Weeks passed, and I thought maybe it was over. Maybe Chloe would realize she was being unreasonable and come to her senses. Then, out of nowhere, she texted me one day. "Hey sis, let's grab coffee and talk wedding stuff. So excited." I could already tell what was happening. Chloe wasn't sorry. She just realized she couldn't plan this wedding without me. So I decided to play along. If Chloe wanted free wedding planning, she was going to get exactly what she paid for. When we met for coffee, Chloe acted as if nothing had happened. She was bubbly, excited, and immediately launched into her new strategy. This time, she wasn't asking me to plan everything. She was acting like she just needed some advice, some recommendations here and there. Nothing too major. I nodded along, sipping my drink, letting her talk, and then she hit me with the first jab. "It's so crazy that my own sister won't help me more," she said, laughing. I thought family was supposed to support each other. My friend's sister planned her wedding for free. I bit my tongue. Well, start by figuring out your budget, I said, trying to steer the conversation back to reality. But, of course, Chloe had no budget. She wanted a luxury wedding and thought she could cut costs by getting discounts or doing everything herself. I reminded her, again, that big weddings cost a lot of money and there were no magical industry discounts available to just anyone. She waved me off, dismissing my advice. "I'll be fine," she said breezily, asking me for my contacts. I gave her a few names of reputable vendors, but I didn't do anything else. I didn't call anyone. I didn't negotiate for her, and I didn't set up any meetings. If she wanted my help, she was going to have to do the work herself. Within a week, the complaints started coming in. The florists were too expensive, the caterers wouldn't work with her, and the venue she wanted required a massive deposit. Chloe called me, frustrated. "I thought you knew people," she said. "Why didn't you help me out with this?" I reminded her that vendors don't give out free services just because you're related to a wedding planner. Chloe was furious, but she said she'd handle it herself. Then came the dress disaster. Chloe had picked out an insanely expensive designer dress, thousands of dollars over her budget, and when it arrived, it didn't fit. I barely hid my disbelief when she looked at me and said, "Can you fix this?" I shrugged. "Maybe look for a cheaper option." She wasn't happy with that. Determined to save money, she tried to DIY everything. Invitations, decor, centerpieces. She had zero artistic ability, though. She tried to hand paint signs, but the letters were wobbly and smudged. She tried floral arrangements, but they wilted because she didn't store them properly. She ordered discount table runners, which arrived wrinkled and fraying at the edges. I warned her again. "Some things are worth paying for." She rolled her eyes. "You're so negative," she said. And that was when I realized this wedding was going to be a disaster. As expected, Chloe didn't take my advice seriously. I had tried to set some boundaries, but she wasn't interested in reality. It was becoming clear that this wedding was going to be a complete mess. And the worst part was, Chloe didn't want to hear the truth. She had this idea in her head that everything would work out magically, and when it didn't, she just shrugged it off as if the universe was conspiring against her. She started with the invitations. She didn't want to pay for a designer or professional service, so she decided to do them herself. Let's just say she didn't have an ounce of design skill. The results were disastrous, poorly printed, mismatched fonts, and blurry images. I told her, "Chloe, these look rushed. Maybe you should just hire a pro to save time and frustration." She ignored me, convinced she could do it better herself. They ended up looking cheap and unprofessional, but Chloe claimed she was on a budget and didn't care what others thought. Then came the flowers. Chloe had always dreamed of having a massive floral arch at the ceremony, but she refused to pay the price for a professional florist. Instead, she tried to make her own arrangements, ordering flowers online. The problem? She didn't know how to store them or arrange them properly, and by the time they arrived, half of them were already wilting. I asked if she needed help, but she insisted, "I've got it under control." So she spent hours trying to salvage the flowers, but it was too late. The result was a sad, droopy arch that was barely recognizable. And then there was the venue. Chloe had her eyes set on this beautiful barn venue, but the price tag was steep, and the venue required a large, non-refundable deposit. I warned her not to book anything before reading the fine print, but Chloe didn't listen. She was so eager to lock everything down, thinking she could always find a way to make it work. Once the deposit was paid, I asked her, "Do you know what's included? What extra costs might come up?" She just brushed me off with a smile, saying, "It'll be fine. I'll figure it out later." Spoiler, she didn't. A few weeks later, Chloe changed her mind about the venue. She wanted something more glamorous, something more Instagram-worthy. The problem was, the deposit for the barn venue was non-refundable, and the new venue was way out of budget. When she tried to back out, she realized it wasn't as simple as canceling and getting her money back. The deposit was gone, and the new venue's prices were through the roof. Chloe panicked. She called me, asking for help again, but all I could do was remind her that she made this decision. And there was nothing I could do now. Her response? "You're supposed to help me, Emily. I thought you were a professional." I just sighed. It was the same old routine. Chloe thought the world would bend to her will just because she asked for it. But the reality of the wedding world didn't work like that. Things had costs. Vendors had schedules. There were no shortcuts, no discounts just because you knew a wedding planner. And then came the dress disaster. Chloe had picked out a designer gown that was far beyond her means. It was stunning, sure, but it cost more than most people's entire wedding budget. I told her again, maybe we should look for something more affordable. You don't want to blow the budget on one thing. But Chloe was insistent. This is my dream dress, she said, as if there was no other option. The dress arrived a few weeks before the wedding, and when she tried it on, it didn't fit. It was too tight around the waist, and the zipper barely zipped. The alterations she assumed would be done didn't even exist. She had no appointment, no tailor, nothing. She called me in a panic. It doesn't fit. What should I do? I told her the obvious. You'll need to get it altered. But time is running out, Chloe. You should have taken care of this earlier. She tried to fix it herself, but all she managed to do was squeeze into it, looking uncomfortable and stressed. The whole thing felt like a ticking time bomb, and I had to watch as Chloe's expectations collided with reality time and time again. I didn't want to say I told you so, but at this point, I couldn't help myself. Chloe kept pushing forward, ignoring every warning and suggestion, convinced everything would come together in the end. I knew better, but I couldn't stop her. Despite all of this, Chloe still refused to accept that her choices had consequences. She'd complain about how everything was falling apart, but when I pointed out where things had gone wrong, she'd get defensive. It's just the way things are. No big deal, she'd say. I was starting to wonder if she'd ever realize how serious all of this was, but I knew deep down she never would. Chloe lived in a world of denial, and no matter how many times I tried to show her the reality, she refused to see it. It was clear to me that Chloe wasn't prepared for what was coming, but what was even clearer was that I was about to get dragged into the fallout. The wedding day arrived, and despite all the warnings, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. The signs had been there for months, and I had done everything I could to prepare Chloe, but I had to accept that this day would be nothing like the fairy tale she'd been dreaming of. I showed up early to help with any last-minute issues, but as soon as I stepped onto the venue grounds, I knew this was going to be a disaster. The outdoor space was beautiful, but there was no backup plan, no tent, no canopy, just an open garden. The weather forecast? A thunderstorm with a 90% chance of rain. I tried to stay positive. Maybe it won't rain. Let's just hope it holds off long enough for the ceremony. But deep down, I knew better. Chloe had put all her eggs in one basket with this outdoor venue, and hadn't bothered to consider what would happen if the weather didn't cooperate. By the time guests began arriving, the first drops of rain started to fall. People scattered, looking for shelter under whatever they could find: trees, umbrellas, the tiny gazebo at the edge of the garden. I watched in disbelief as the guests huddled together, awkwardly trying to stay dry while Chloe paced back and forth, fuming about the rain. "Why is it always my wedding that gets ruined by the weather?" she shouted, the panic in her voice now palpable. At this point, there was nothing I could say. I had warned her about this. I had told her to prepare for bad weather, but Chloe never thought it would happen. Now, all her DIY decorations were being ruined by the rain watercolor signs running, flowers wilting, and the cake. Don't even get me started on the cake. The chaos only continued as the ceremony was about to begin. No seating chart had been made. Guests wandered around, confused, trying to figure out where they were supposed to sit. The elderly relatives were especially lost, standing around in the rain, unsure of where to go. The venue staff kept asking Chloe who was in charge, but she was too busy yelling at the weather to even respond. Ryan, poor guy, was nowhere to be found. He was supposed to be helping out, but he had disappeared into the crowd, probably trying to avoid the mess. Chloe was on the verge of losing it, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. She had spent months ignoring every piece of advice I gave her, and now it was all falling apart. The ceremony finally started, but things didn't get better. The floral arch that Chloe had so proudly designed herself was a sad, wilted version of what it was supposed to be. She had insisted on doing it herself, of course, thinking it would save money. It didn't. Chloe looked at the arch and immediately started muttering under her breath. "It looks awful," she said, trying to hide her frustration. "I knew I should have paid someone to do it. No kidding. But that was just the beginning. The caterer, who had been booked months ago, didn't show up on time. It was supposed to be an elegant sit-down meal, but when they finally arrived hours late, they didn't have enough food. The trays were half empty, and what they did have was low quality. The guests were furious, and I could hear the grumbling from across the lawn. The buffet-style setup was hastily thrown together, and everyone was scrambling to grab whatever they could. By now, people were soaked, hungry, and annoyed. They weren't just disappointed with the food, they were frustrated with the whole event. And I knew that Chloe, deep down, knew it was her fault. When it came time for the speeches, Chloe's maid of honor, one of the few people who hadn't bailed out on her yet, gave a half-hearted speech that barely hit the mark. Guests were too distracted by the rain, the food disaster, and the miserable atmosphere to even care. It was like everyone was just waiting for the night to end. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, the music cut out. Chloe had insisted on using a Bluetooth speaker for the ceremony music because it was cheaper than hiring a DJ. Of course, halfway through the night, the speaker suddenly cut out, and no one knew how to fix it. Guests started awkwardly standing around, with no music to fill the uncomfortable silence. Chloe looked at me in desperation. "Why isn't this working? You must know how to fix this." "I don't know, Chloe. I'm not your tech support," I replied, trying to keep my cool. But honestly, I was beyond frustrated. By this point, the guests had begun to drift away. Some were leaving early, others were just standing around in the rain, getting wet, and making snide comments about how chaotic everything was. I couldn't believe how fast everything had gone downhill. Chloe, still in her dress, was pacing back and forth, muttering to herself. She was on the verge of a breakdown, and it was almost painful to watch. She finally stormed up to me, eyes red, hands shaking. "Why didn't you help me?" she screamed. "You're my sister. I thought you were supposed to make this perfect." I looked at her, and for a moment, I didn't even know how to respond. I had warned her over and over again. I had offered advice. I had suggested she hire professionals, but she wouldn't listen. Now she was blaming me for everything that had gone wrong. All I could say was, "Chloe, this is what happens when you try to cut corners and ignore advice. I can't fix it now." She stood there, fuming, but I wasn't going to apologize. I had tried to help her from the beginning, but at this point, I knew there was no saving this wedding. The damage had already been done. The wedding night was a disaster. It was almost like everyone had already written it off, but we still had to get through the final moments. I stayed around long enough to make sure no one needed anything more from me. But honestly, I was just exhausted. I didn't want to say anything more to Chloe. The damage was done. The evening felt like it was dragging on, with the rain still coming down, the soggy decorations, and the disheartened guests. I could hear whispers, murmurs of disappointment, and a few annoyed comments about how everything had fallen apart. But the real fallout came later that night after I went home and collapsed into bed, only to be bombarded with messages and notifications. First, there were the pictures. People who had attended the wedding started posting them online. I wasn't sure if I was more frustrated or amused. The DIY signs, now a drenched mess, were front and center in a lot of photos. People laughing at the soggy, half-done floral arrangements. The empty buffet table, with just a few trays of food barely touched. One post caught my eye. A distant cousin had posted a picture of the rain-soaked wedding arch, captioning it, "DIY gone wrong." I wasn't surprised. The photos told the whole story. And then there were the comments. I scrolled through, seeing how everyone was laughing at the chaos. Some guests had posted their own critiques in wedding Facebook groups. One comment I couldn't ignore was from one of Chloe's bridesmaids, who had snapped a photo of the mess with the caption, "I've seen some messy weddings, but this one takes the cake." And suddenly, it hit me. Chloe's nightmare was becoming viral. What was supposed to be a once-in-a-lifetime day was now an internet sensation. The next morning, I checked my phone to find a dozen texts from Chloe. She was furious. "What's the deal with the photos?" she demanded. "You know people are talking about the wedding, right? Why didn't you stop them?" I was stunned. Was she seriously blaming me for the photos? I tried to explain that I had no control over what people posted, but she wasn't having it. Her messages were filled with anger and panic. "You should have stopped them from taking pictures. You're my sister. Why didn't you do anything?" I didn't even know how to respond to that. I told her, as calmly as I could. Chloe, I didn't organize the wedding. You did. You decided not to hire professionals, and you chose to ignore all the advice I gave you. The pictures are a reflection of your decisions. Of course, she didn't want to hear that. I knew I couldn't take responsibility for something that was clearly out of my hands. But Chloe didn't see it that way. She continued to blame me, and soon, it wasn't just the pictures. She started accusing me of sabotaging the entire thing. You never wanted me to have a perfect wedding. You've always hated my ideas. This is your fault. You wanted it to fail. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This was Chloe's reality, her complete refusal to take responsibility for the mess she had created. She couldn't accept that all the things that had gone wrong were a result of her decisions. She'd spent months pushing me away and telling me she had it all under control, only to now turn around and blame me for everything. But it didn't stop there. Chloe's meltdown spread beyond our immediate circle. Some of our extended family members started calling me. They told me to just apologize to her and fix the damage. I was told that I was being too harsh, and that family should support each other. But what no one understood, what Chloe didn't want to admit, was that I had supported her. I had warned her. I had offered my professional advice, and she chose to ignore it. At this point, I wasn't going to be guilted into doing something that would only make things worse. By the time I looked at social media again, the story had spread like wildfire. People from all over had started sharing the wedding disaster. Complete strangers were chiming in on how badly the day had gone. One person even posted a breakdown of everything that went wrong, and it was going viral. I saw comments laughing about how everything from the seating arrangements to the food was a joke. Strangers were mocking her DIY wedding favors and bemoaning the lack of a real photographer. Chloe called me again, furious. I can't believe this. This is so embarrassing. You've ruined everything. And that's when I finally said it. Chloe, this isn't on me. This is all on you. You made these decisions, and now you're trying to blame me for the consequences. It's not fair, and it's not right. Her response? You should have done something. You could have helped me, but you didn't. That was the moment I realized Chloe was never going to take responsibility. She had already shifted the blame onto me, and I knew I wouldn't win this argument. Not with her. But as the wedding debacle went viral, my phone kept buzzing. What Chloe didn't know was that the attention this disaster was getting wasn't all bad for me. People started calling me for quotes on weddings of their own. Some were inquiring about how to avoid the same mistakes Chloe had made. Others, strangely enough, wanted me to plan their weddings. The demand for my services grew, and I couldn't help but feel a small sense of vindication. The disaster that was Chloe's wedding had inadvertently boosted my business. I knew I had to distance myself from Chloe, but for now, I had a new focus. My career. The viral disaster was turning into an opportunity, and I had to take advantage of it. Chloe, meanwhile, was still in full damage control mode. She started spinning her own version of events, claiming the vendors had scammed her. The weather had betrayed her, and even that I had sabotaged the wedding. The fact that she had blamed everything and everyone except herself only made things worse. The more she denied her own role in the failure, the worse the fallout became. But I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over yet. The wedding may have ended, but the aftermath was just beginning. The aftermath of Chloe's wedding spiraled out of control faster than I could have ever imagined. At first, she tried to spin it blaming the vendors, the weather, everyone but herself. But no one was buying it. I could see the cracks in her marriage already. Ryan, who had stayed mostly quiet throughout the whole ordeal, started to pull away. I heard rumors from family members that he was distant, avoiding Chloe as much as possible. It wasn't long before he moved out. I didn't hear the full details right away, but it was clear the wedding hadn't just ruined the day, it had destroyed their relationship. Chloe, of course, refused to accept that the wedding was a reflection of their issues. She kept calling me, asking for help, asking me to fix it, but this time, I wasn't going to step in. A month later, Ryan filed for divorce. I couldn't say I was surprised. How could a marriage survive after a wedding that was such a chaotic mess? Chloe's financial situation wasn't helping either. She had maxed out credit cards, taken out loans, and had little left to show for it except a series of failed DIY projects. When the bills started piling up, she turned to our parents, begging them to help her cover the costs. They tried to reason with her, but the reality was harsh. Our mom told her, "You need to figure this out yourself, Chloe." But Chloe didn't want to face the consequences of her actions. Instead, she threw tantrums, blaming everyone else. She accused me of sabotaging her wedding again, and even tried to say that our parents were the ones who failed her. Meanwhile, I was starting to get calls for new business opportunities, some from people who had been at the wedding and had heard the stories of its disaster. Chloe didn't see it yet, but everything she had done to avoid responsibility was catching up with her. Matt's family had seen it too. They sat him down, and for the first time, I think he really saw how reckless she had been. He realized that their marriage was based on a shaky foundation, one built on selfishness, unrealistic expectations, and complete disregard for reality. The divorce was inevitable. While Chloe's life fell apart, mine was picking up. Business was booming, and as Chloe spiraled further into denial, I stayed focused on building my career. I couldn't help but feel a little vindicated, but I also knew that things with Chloe were far from over. As Chloe's life continued to spiral, the cracks in her world deepened. The divorce was official within 2 months. Chloe was now alone, trying to salvage what was left of her marriage, which, frankly, had never been strong in the first place. She spent weeks calling me, sending long, tearful texts about how she couldn't do this alone and how everything was falling apart. But I knew better. I wasn't her savior anymore, and I wasn't about to play that role. The time for me to help had long passed. I had already given her every opportunity to fix things on her own, but she chose to ignore everything. What followed was a predictable, desperate series of attempts from Chloe to get her life back together. She called our parents again, asking them to help with the mounting debts from her disastrous wedding planning. They had been patient with her up to that point, but even they were running out of sympathy. Our mom finally laid it out in blunt terms. "Chloe, we've done everything we can for you. It's time to take responsibility for your mistakes." That's when things really started to crumble for her. Chloe had taken out loans and maxed out credit cards to fund the wedding, thinking everything would just magically fall into place. But now, with no savings and no support from Ryan or anyone else, she was facing a serious financial crisis. Our parents wouldn't bail her out, and I certainly wasn't about to. It was then that Chloe started to try and rebuild her image, trying to convince anyone who would listen that the wedding disaster wasn't her fault. She posted on social media, framing herself as the victim of a bad luck streak, blaming the vendors, the weather, and even me for her ruined day. She even went so far as to say I sabotaged the wedding. But by now, people were seeing through her act. The online wedding community had already had a field day with the disaster, and no one was buying her version of events. Some of her friends and family started unfollowing her, distancing themselves from her drama. Chloe didn't get the sympathy she was hoping for. Instead, she got more isolation. People were tired of her excuses, tired of her blaming everyone except herself. It was clear to everyone that she wasn't willing to take responsibility, and the consequences were catching up with her. Meanwhile, my business was thriving. The wedding disaster that Chloe had so desperately tried to bury had actually brought in a lot of new clients. I got inquiries from people who had seen the wedding unfold on social media and didn't want to make the same mistakes. Word of mouth spread quickly, and soon I was getting calls for bigger events clients with substantial budgets, some of whom had high-profile weddings of their own in mind. One of those calls came from a celebrity's assistant, asking me to plan a high-end wedding. My heart raced as I saw the budget they were offering. It was more than Chloe's entire wedding cost. I couldn't believe it. The nightmare she'd created had, in a twisted way, made me the go-to planner for people who wanted to avoid the chaos she had caused. As my business took off, Chloe's situation got worse. She tried to find a job, but her reputation was in ruins. No one wanted to hire her, and she had no real experience to fall back on. She refused to accept that she needed to start from the bottom. Her entitled attitude only made matters worse. She expected to get management positions when she hadn't proven herself. She hopped from interview to interview, but every door seemed to slam in her face. Eventually, the breaking point came. Chloe found out that Ryan had moved on. Not only was he dating someone new, but he was happy. He had found someone calm, organized, and drama-free, everything Chloe wasn't. I watched as she lashed out, claiming that he had been cheating on her before their split, but no one was listening anymore. They had all seen the truth. Ryan had tried. He had put up with her chaos for too long, And now he was free. For Chloe, that was the final blow. She called me again, trying to pull me back into her mess. Please, Emily, I need help. I have nowhere to turn. I don't know what to do. I could hear the desperation in her voice, but I was done. I didn't pick up the phone. I let it go to voicemail. This time, I wasn't saving her. Months went by, and Chloe's life was a wreck. She finally managed to get a low-paying job, the kind she would have never considered before. But it didn't last. The work was beneath her, and her attitude got her fired. She refused to take responsibility for her failures. But it was when she tried to reach out to me again that I knew it was over. Chloe had posted a GoFundMe, asking for money to help her start over after betrayal. She wrote a long, sob story about how everyone had turned against her and how she was now left with nothing. But when she posted it, no one donated. The support she hoped for never came. Finally, our parents had had enough. They told her there would be no more handouts, no more saving her. Chloe had to figure things out on her own. And for the first time in her life, she had no choice but to face the consequences of her actions. I never responded to her. Instead, I focused on my career. My reputation continued to grow, and I found peace in knowing that I had stayed true to my boundaries. Chloe had every chance to make things right, but she had thrown them all away. The final irony? Chloe admitted to some of our family that she had made a huge mistake not listening to me from the start. But it was too late. No one cared anymore. She had burned too many bridges. She had learned her lesson, but at a high cost. Meanwhile, I was booking weddings that were on a scale she could only dream of. Life had come full circle, and it felt good to finally be in control. I had learned something too. Sometimes, you can only help people who are willing to help themselves. And Chloe? She was still learning that lesson the hard way.